What if I told you that the U.S. military has a long history of secretly experimenting on its own soldiers? Experiments that shattered minds, poisoned bodies, and left thousands with lifelong scars. From CIA mind control projects and chemical warfare tests to nuclear radiation exposure and unapproved vaccines, these weren't enemy attacks. These were deliberate experiments conducted in the name of science and national security. And the worst part? Many of the soldiers had no idea they were test subjects. This is the shocking truth behind 7 of the most disturbing military experiments in U.S. history. Stay with us because what you're about to hear was never meant to be known. Project MKUltra. Project MKUltra was a covert program run by the CIA from the early 1950s to the early 1970s. Its purpose was to investigate mind control, behavioral modification, and psychological manipulation, often using unwitting test subjects. The program stemmed from Cold War fears that enemies like the Soviet Union or China were developing advanced interrogation and brainwashing techniques. The U.S. government sought to develop its own methods to counteract these techniques and potentially use them for intelligence purposes. Many of the experiments were conducted on military personnel, prisoners, mental patients, and ordinary civilians, often without their consent. The program tested various drugs, primarily LSD, along with hypnosis, sensory deprivation, electroshock therapy, and other extreme psychological methods to determine their effects on the human mind. One of the most infamous aspects of MKUltra involved the testing of LSD on unsuspecting individuals. The CIA believed that hallucinogens might be useful for brainwashing, interrogation, or even controlling enemy minds. Some soldiers were given LSD without their knowledge and then observed as they struggled with hallucinations, paranoia, and confusion. Some test subjects suffered permanent psychological damage, and a few even died as a result of the experiments. One well-known victim was Frank Olson, a U.S. Army biochemist who was unknowingly dosed with LSD and later died under mysterious circumstances. Official reports claim he jumped from a New York hotel window in a suicidal episode, but later investigations and testimony from his family suggested he may have been murdered to cover up the experiment. Aside from LSD, other experiments involved electroshock therapy, sleep deprivation, and forced isolation. Some test subjects underwent weeks of sensory deprivation, where they were placed in completely dark and silent rooms to see how it affected their mental state. Others were subjected to hypnosis or high doses of barbiturates and amphetamines in rapid succession to test how they would react under extreme conditions. The military hoped to develop techniques that would allow them to break enemy prisoners or create programmed operatives who could follow commands without question. The secret nature of MKUltra meant that many participants never knew they were part of an experiment until years later, if ever. Documents were destroyed when the program was officially shut down in 1973 on orders from then CIA Director Richard Helms, making it difficult to determine the full extent of the program. The revelations about MKUltra came to light in the mid-1970s through congressional hearings and investigations, particularly the work of the Church Committee, which uncovered many of the CIA's illegal and unethical activities. While the U.S. government officially disavowed MKUltra and claimed that such experiments would never happen again, the full extent of the damage caused remains unknown. The program not only shattered lives, but also raised serious ethical questions about the government's willingness to experiment on its own people in the name of national security. Operation Whitecoat. Operation Whitecoat was a secret U.S. Army medical research program conducted between 1954 and 1973, primarily at Fort Detrick, Maryland. Unlike many other unethical military experiments, Whitecoat was unique in that its test subjects, mostly Seventh-day Adventist conscientious objectors, volunteered for the program. These men refused to carry weapons or engage in combat due to their religious beliefs, but were willing to serve their country in other ways. Instead of traditional military service, they participated in experiments designed to study the effects of biological warfare agents and develop vaccines and treatments for deadly diseases. The soldiers involved in Operation Whitecoat were intentionally exposed to a variety of infectious diseases, including Q fever, tularemia, yellow fever, and Venezuelan equine encephalitis. They were placed in controlled environments, often inside airtight chambers, where researchers exposed them to aerosolized bacteria or viruses. In some cases, the diseases were delivered through injections or contaminated food and water. The goal was to monitor how the pathogens affected the human body and to develop medical countermeasures that could protect both soldiers and civilians in the event of a biological attack. The experiments were highly controlled, and participants were closely monitored by military doctors and scientists. Unlike other unethical military experiments, such as those conducted under Project MKUltra, Whitecoat volunteers were required to give informed consent before participating. However, the extent to which they fully understood the risks remains a subject of debate. Some Whitecoat veterans later reported that they felt pressured into participating or were not given enough information about the long-term health consequences of the experiments. Despite the ethical concerns, Operation Whitecoat contributed significantly to medical and scientific advancements. The research led to the development of vaccines and treatments for several serious diseases, some of which are still in use today. The program also helped improve the U.S. military's ability to defend against biological warfare, which was a major concern during the Cold War. However, not all participants emerged unscathed. Some Whitecoat veterans suffered long-term health problems, including chronic fatigue, joint pain, and respiratory issues. Others reported psychological distress from their participation in the program. When Operation Whitecoat officially ended in 1973, the Army shifted its biological research focus to other programs. The legacy of Whitecoat remains controversial. Some see it as a noble effort that helped save lives by advancing medical science, while others view it as an ethically questionable experiment that exploited the willingness of conscientious objectors. In 2016, the Seventh-day Adventist Church formally recognized the contributions of Whitecoat volunteers, acknowledging their role in improving public health and military medicine. However, for many of the former test subjects, the unanswered questions about the long-term effects of their participation still linger. Mustard gas and chemical tests in WWII. During World War II, the U.S. military conducted secret chemical weapons experiments on its own soldiers to study the effects of mustard gas and other chemical agents. These tests, which began in the early 1940s, were designed to determine how different racial and ethnic groups reacted to chemical warfare, as well as to develop protective measures for troops in the event of a chemical attack. Thousands of American servicemen were subjected to these experiments, often without their informed consent, in a program that remained classified for decades. Mustard gas is a powerful blistering agent that causes severe burns, lung damage, and long-term health problems. The military wanted to understand how soldiers would respond to exposure and whether certain racial groups had different levels of resistance to the gas. As a result, they conducted race-based experiments on Black, Puerto Rican, and Japanese American troops, exposing them to mustard gas in enclosed chambers or applying it directly to their skin. These tests were not only scientifically questionable, but also deeply unethical, as they targeted minority soldiers who often had little power to refuse. In some cases, soldiers were placed in gas chambers and forced to endure prolonged exposure, while others had mustard gas applied to small patches of skin to observe the effects. The burns and blisters caused by the gas were excruciating, and many of the test subjects suffered from chronic respiratory issues, scarring, and long-term health complications. Some soldiers were hospitalized for months, while others carried the effects of the experiments for the rest of their lives. Despite the severe injuries, participants were often sworn to secrecy and denied medical care after the tests ended. The military justified these experiments by claiming they were necessary for national security. At the time, there was a widespread fear that Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan might use chemical weapons, and the U.S. needed to be prepared. However, after the war ended, the government covered up the experiments, and many of the affected soldiers were left without recognition or assistance. The tests remained classified for decades, and it wasn't until the 1990s that the government officially acknowledged what had happened. In 1993, a U.S. Senate hearing revealed the full extent of the mustard gas experiments, prompting calls for compensation and medical care for the surviving test subjects. The Department of Veterans Affairs eventually offered some assistance, but many affected veterans struggled for years to receive proper treatment. Some were denied benefits because they had no official records of their participation, as many documents had been destroyed or remained classified. The mustard gas experiments of World War II are now recognized as one of the darker chapters of U.S. military history. While the research contributed to the development of protective gear and medical treatments for chemical warfare, it came at the cost of human suffering. The soldiers who endured these tests were not given the respect or care they deserved, and for many, justice came too late. The legacy of these experiments serves as a reminder of the ethical failures that can occur when military secrecy and scientific ambition outweigh basic human rights. Project 112 and Shipboard Hazards and Defense, SHAD Project 112, was a top-secret U.S. military program conducted during the Cold War between 1962 and 1973 to test biological and chemical weapons as well as methods for defending against them. One of the most infamous parts of Project 112 was Shipboard Hazards and Defense, SHAD, which specifically involved testing chemical and biological agents on U.S. Navy sailors. These experiments were carried out without the full knowledge or consent of the personnel involved, exposing thousands of service members to potentially harmful substances while they performed their regular duties at sea. The program was developed under the Department of Defense and largely conducted by the Army's Deseret Test Center in Utah. The stated goal was to understand how chemical and biological agents behaved in different environments, particularly in maritime conditions. Military leaders feared that the Soviet Union or other adversaries might use such weapons in future conflicts, so they sought to develop countermeasures. However, rather than using controlled laboratory conditions, the military chose to conduct these tests in real-world settings, using unsuspecting sailors as human test subjects. During SHAD, Navy ships were deliberately sprayed with various biological and chemical agents, including VX nerve gas, sarin, and other potentially lethal substances. Some tests used simulants, harmless chemicals meant to mimic real agents, but in many cases, actual harmful compounds were employed. The agents were dispersed using aircraft, shipboard sprayers, or explosive devices to study how they would spread, settle, and affect personnel. Sailors on board had little to no knowledge of what was happening, and many were not given protective gear or decontamination procedures after exposure. The long-term health effects of these experiments were devastating for many of the participants. Over the years, veterans who were unknowingly exposed to these substances reported serious medical conditions, including respiratory diseases, neurological disorders, cancers, and immune system deficiencies. Many experienced chronic health problems without ever knowing they had been part of a secret military experiment. When they sought medical treatment through the Department of Veterans Affairs, they often found their illnesses were not recognized as service-related because the government had kept the program classified for decades. For years, the government denied that Project 112 and SHAD had even taken place. It wasn't until the early 2000s, after persistent pressure from veterans and investigative journalists, that the Pentagon finally acknowledged the existence of the program. In 2002, the Department of Defense declassified many documents related to Project 112, revealing the true extent of the testing. The revelations led to outrage, congressional investigations, and demands for justice. However, the government was slow to provide assistance to affected veterans, and many continued to struggle with serious health problems without adequate compensation or recognition. The legacy of Project 112 and SHAD remains a stark example of how the military's pursuit of national security can sometimes come at the expense of its own personnel. The experiments not only violated ethical standards, but also demonstrated a disregard for the health and well-being of the very people sworn to defend the country. While some steps have been taken to support the affected veterans, many still feel that the full truth has never been revealed and that justice has been long overdue. Nuclear testing and radiation exposure. During the Cold War, the U.S. military conducted extensive nuclear weapons testing, often using its own soldiers as test subjects to study the effects of radiation exposure and nuclear blasts. From the 1940s through the 1960s, thousands of service members, known as atomic veterans, were deliberately placed in or near nuclear test sites in the deserts of Nevada, the Pacific Ocean, and other locations. These experiments were part of a larger effort to understand how nuclear warfare would impact soldiers on the battlefield and to develop strategies for surviving and fighting in a nuclear war. One of the most infamous test programs was Operation Crossroads in 1946, which involved detonating nuclear bombs near U.S. Navy ships at Bikini Atoll in the Pacific Ocean. Thousands of sailors were stationed on or near the ships to observe the blasts and were later ordered to board radioactive vessels to assess the damage. Many were exposed to dangerous levels of radiation without proper protective gear or decontamination procedures. Over the following years, similar experiments continued with Operation Desert Rock, where ground troops were stationed just miles from nuclear explosions in the Nevada desert. Soldiers were ordered to march toward the blast sites shortly after detonation, often without knowing the risks involved. The military wanted to see how soldiers would react in a nuclear battlefield scenario, but in reality, these experiments exposed troops to severe radiation poisoning. Radiation exposure had devastating effects on many of the atomic veterans. In the years following the tests, thousands developed serious health conditions, including leukemia, various cancers, thyroid disorders, and other radiation-related illnesses. Many also experienced genetic damage, leading to birth defects in their children. However, because the nuclear test programs were classified, veterans who became sick had no medical records linking their conditions to radiation exposure. When they sought medical care or disability benefits from the Department of Veterans Affairs, they were often denied because there was no official acknowledgement of their participation in the tests. For decades, the U.S. government refused to take responsibility for the harm caused by nuclear testing. It wasn't until the 1980s that atomic veterans began speaking out and demanding justice. In 1988, the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, RECA, was passed, finally recognizing the suffering of some nuclear test participants and providing limited financial compensation. However, many veterans and their families felt the government's response was inadequate, as thousands of affected individuals were left without support. Even today, some atomic veterans continue to fight for full recognition of their service and the long-term consequences they endured. The nuclear testing experiments conducted on U.S. soldiers remain one of the most controversial and tragic episodes in military history. While these tests helped advance America's nuclear capabilities, they did so at the cost of the health and lives of thousands of service members. The secrecy surrounding the experiments meant that many veterans never knew they had been part of dangerous radiation exposure until it was too late. The legacy of these tests serves as a reminder of the ethical failures in the pursuit of military superiority and the lasting consequences of government secrecy. Edgewood Arsenal human experiments. Between 1955 and 1975, the U.S. Army conducted secret chemical and pharmacological experiments on thousands of soldiers at Edgewood Arsenal, a military research facility in Maryland. The experiments, which were overseen by the U.S. Army Chemical Corps, aimed to test the effects of various chemical agents on human subjects, including nerve agents, hallucinogens, and psychoactive drugs. The primary goal was to determine whether these substances could be used in warfare, either as incapacitating agents for enemy forces or as protective measures for American troops. However, the soldiers who participated were often unaware of the full risks involved, and many suffered long-term consequences from their exposure. Edgewood Arsenal experiments involved the administration of nerve agents like VX and sarin, as well as hallucinogenic drugs such as LSD, BZ, a powerful delirium-inducing chemical, and PCP. Soldiers were exposed through injections, inhalation, and skin contact to see how their bodies would react. Some tests studied whether these chemicals could enhance interrogation techniques, while others explored their potential as non-lethal weapons to incapacitate enemy forces. Volunteers were often told they were participating in harmless studies to develop defensive measures, but in reality, they were being subjected to dangerous substances that could cause severe psychological and physiological effects. The consequences for test subjects were often severe. Many soldiers experienced hallucinations, paranoia, seizures, and even complete mental breakdowns after exposure to powerful psychoactive drugs. Others suffered from nerve damage, chronic pain, and long-term cognitive impairment. Some soldiers were left with permanent personality changes or developed serious psychiatric disorders, including schizophrenia and severe depression. Despite these outcomes, the military continued its experiments for 2 decades, often cycling new recruits through the program without fully informing them of the risks. The secrecy surrounding the Edgewood Arsenal experiments meant that many veterans had no medical records of their exposure, making it nearly impossible for them to receive proper treatment later in life. When some veterans began experiencing severe health problems and sought help from the Department of Veterans Affairs, they were often denied benefits due to the classified nature of the experiments. The government did not officially acknowledge the extent of the testing until the late 1990s, when declassified documents and lawsuits exposed what had happened. In 2007, a class action lawsuit was filed against the Department of Veterans Affairs, the CIA, and the Department of Defense on behalf of the Edgewood test subjects. The lawsuit alleged that the government had failed to properly inform soldiers of the risks and had neglected their long-term health needs. The case brought renewed attention to the experiments, but the government continued to resist full accountability. Although some veterans eventually received compensation and healthcare support, many never received justice for the suffering they endured. The Edgewood Arsenal human experiments remain one of the most disturbing examples of military research on human subjects. While the program was initially justified as a way to develop new defensive and tactical measures, it ultimately exposed thousands of American soldiers to dangerous and untested chemical agents without their informed consent. The experiments not only violated ethical standards, but also left a lasting impact on the health and lives of those who participated. Today, the Edgewood Arsenal experiments serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked military research and the consequences of prioritizing scientific advancement over human well-being. Gulf War syndrome and experimental vaccines. During the 1990 to 1991 Gulf War, nearly 700,000 U.S. service members were deployed to the Middle East as part of Operation Desert Storm. After returning home, tens of thousands began experiencing mysterious chronic illnesses, now collectively known as Gulf War Syndrome, GWS. Symptoms included severe fatigue, chronic pain, memory loss, respiratory issues, digestive problems, and neurological disorders. For years, the U.S. government downplayed the condition, but mounting evidence suggested that soldiers had been exposed to a mix of hazardous substances, including experimental vaccines, nerve agent exposure, and toxic battlefield conditions that may have caused lasting health damage. One of the most controversial factors linked to Gulf War syndrome is the use of experimental vaccines, particularly the anthrax and botulinum toxoid vaccines. Fearing that Saddam Hussein might use biological weapons, the U.S. military rushed to immunize troops against potential threats. However, the vaccines administered during the Gulf War were not fully tested for long-term safety, and many soldiers reported severe adverse reactions after receiving them. The anthrax vaccine, in particular, contained squalene, an unapproved adjuvant that was later found in the blood of some sick Gulf War veterans. Squalene has been linked to autoimmune disorders, leading many to believe that the experimental nature of the vaccine played a significant role in their illnesses. Beyond vaccines, Gulf War soldiers were also exposed to chemical nerve agents and toxic smoke. After the war, reports surfaced that U.S. forces had destroyed an Iraqi weapons depot in Qamishiyah, Iraq, unknowingly releasing sarin and cyclosarin nerve gases into the air. Thousands of troops stationed nearby may have inhaled these deadly chemicals, triggering long-term neurological damage. Additionally, oil fires set by retreating Iraqi forces created thick clouds of toxic smoke, which many troops breathed in for weeks. The burning of hazardous waste in open-air pits, a common military practice, further contributed to respiratory problems and toxic exposure among personnel. Another suspected cause of Gulf War syndrome is the heavy use of pyridostigmine bromide (PB) pills, which were given to soldiers as a preventative measure against nerve gas attacks. These pills were meant to act as a protective buffer against chemical weapons, but they had never been extensively tested for long-term use. Many veterans later developed severe neurological issues, leading some researchers to suggest that PB pills overstimulated the nervous system, causing long-term damage. For years, Gulf War veterans struggled to receive proper medical care and recognition for their illnesses. The Department of Veterans Affairs, VA, was slow to acknowledge Gulf War syndrome, and many veterans were denied disability benefits because the government did not officially recognize the condition. It wasn't until 1997, after intense pressure from advocacy groups, that the VA formally recognized GWS as a legitimate health issue. Even then, many veterans continued to face bureaucratic obstacles when seeking treatment. Scientific studies have since confirmed that Gulf War veterans suffer from higher rates of chronic illnesses and neurological disorders than other military groups. Despite this, the exact cause of Gulf War syndrome remains controversial and heavily debated. Some government reports have suggested stress and psychological factors, while independent researchers argue that toxic exposures and experimental medical treatments are the true culprits. To this day, Gulf War syndrome remains a symbol of government negligence and the risks of using military personnel as test subjects for unproven medical interventions. While progress has been made in understanding the illness, thousands of Gulf War veterans continue to struggle for proper medical care and recognition, making it one of the most tragic and unresolved military health crises in U.S. history.